I'm one of the employment partners at Fox Williams, and I've been giving a lot of advice to employers during lockdown regarding all of the various employment law issues that this unprecedented situation has thrown up. And I know that this morning it's a rare opportunity to be sort of directly connected with some of you. So although we can't see you, you can see us. And I know that there are a number of friends and clients known to me in the audience and many new people. So welcome to everybody and those who watch the webinar later as a recording. And I am going to be talking to you today, as Joe said, about the various laws that have arisen during COVID. The pandemic has given rise to a lot of new employment law, and most notably the furlough scheme, but it's also necessitated the application of existing law to new circumstances. And those of you who've been receiving our HR Law newsletters will know that we've been covering these issues throughout lockdown. And many of the issues that I am going to talk to you about today have already been covered in the newsletter, and some of them will be covered in the newsletter. And as Joe mentioned at the beginning of the session, if you'd like to receive our newsletters in the future, then there is a function in the chat function where you can just sort of click through to become subscribers, and you're very welcome to do so. We've been aiming to give a lot of free information to employers, which we hope has been useful as our sort of doing our bit, as it were, during COVID. But the first topic I'm going to cover is working in the office. And this is a really funny one in a way, because normally the HR challenge is to get everybody to turn up for work. And the big debate at the moment is, are you actually allowed to go to your office if you want to? The current situation's on the screen. During lockdown 2, the principle is that indoor gatherings are generally prohibited, and there are restrictions on leaving home, but not where it's reasonably necessary for the purpose of work, or where it is not reasonably possible to work from home. And that legal position set out in the coronavirus regulations is supplemented by government guidance that says that everyone who can work effectively from home should do so. There's been a debate about what is effective working, and our view of Fox Williams is that's a mix of business and personal considerations. Are you going stir crazy at home? Do you have mental health issues that necessitate you appearing in the office to socialize and to feel better? Do you have the right equipment at home? And are you needed in the office for good reasons relating to the function that you perform? Of course, if you go to work, if your employer provides an office environment for you, it has to be COVID secure. And there's lots of guidance as to what that means. But next slide, because I think that from next week, from the 2nd of December, if you read the government's COVID-19 winter plan, and you have a close look at what it says about working in the office, that the position, I think, is subtly changing. For all 3 tiers, it will be permitted to go to work where that is reasonably necessary. I think that's the current position. But the government guidance looks as if it's going to be changing, which supplements the coronavirus regulations, because the government have said in the COVID-19 winter plan, the statement that's up on your screen, which says the government encourages employers to enable a greater degree of home working and will strengthen guidance to be very clear that anyone who can work from home should do so. And I have a feeling that that means that even if it's suboptimal to be at home, but if you can work from home, that's where you should be. And I think that is a subtle shift. And that looks as if it will be enforced during the tier system until the government's route map to get us out of this disaster involving vaccines and testing works, and we can return to some form of normality. There is still recognition in the COVID-19 winter plan that there are specific reasons where attendance in the workplace is necessary, such as mental health issues and the need to be on site physically. And we are, of course, awaiting yet another iteration of the government's guidance on office working. And as usual, there's a lag between Boris Johnson saying what things are going to look like and the government lawyers and civil servants catching up with the drafting of both the legislation and the guidance. So you have to keep an eye on the government's website in order to be completely up to date. But at the moment, as of this morning, that appears to be the position. Obviously, we're all waiting the big news today to find out which tier we're in. And there is some hope this morning that we won't be in tier 3 in London, which is what I've put up on the screen, but we'll actually be in tier 2, but we'll have to wait to see what happens. Next slide. In the government's COVID-19 winter plan, quite a lot is made of testing, and we've all been hearing about the Liverpool case study, where with the help of the army, lots of people have been tested using the new rapid flow testing system. And the reports coming from Liverpool are that that is being very helpful. And this throws up the possibility that employers may be able to use a testing system in order to help employees go back to work safely. And there are some private healthcare providers getting in touch with employers at the moment to suggest that they can make available tests to help employees return to work. And that will obviously build the confidence of employees that when they do go back to work, it will be safe for them to do so. At the moment, though, I feel this may be leaping ahead a bit, because if the government are going to advise everyone to stay at home if they possibly can be at home, this is more likely to be relevant to perhaps the new year, when it's possible to re-emerge and start going back into the office in a significant way. And at that point, I think the availability of rapid flow tests in large numbers, either through the NHS or through private providers, could be extremely helpful to employers. And that will throw up, of course, a number of ethical and other issues around, can you force people to have tests, the fact that that's a medical procedure, the use of personal data relating to testing, and so on and so forth. So obviously we'll be writing about that in due course in HR law, but at the moment I think that's probably something just to stick on your to watch list, along with something else which I saw in the paper yesterday, which is apparently the government are exploring whether or not we might technically be able to have vaccine passports. So that's going to throw up a lot of issues for employers around whether they can lawfully and legitimately and properly ask employees to flash a vaccine passport in order to get back into work. Another topic for a future HR law issue, and I haven't, to be honest, completely got my head around that one yet, and not yet ready to advise you on all the moral and ethical issues relating to that. Sticking with the current moment, and next slide, working from home. Well, we're all going to be at home for ages by the looks of it, while the government strategy for vaccine and testing gets underway. And this seems to me to be a moment where employers ought to be thinking harder about their health and safety responsibilities and responsibilities in general for employees at home. The key legal point is that all the health and safety legislation, including the Health and Safety at Work Act and all the regulations made under it, apply in the home workplace as well as in the office or the normal workplace. And it seems to me that it's now time for the employers to step up and ensure that everyone is working safely at home, because everyone's been at home for rather a long time now, and all sorts of problems are likely to be emerging relating to, well, eyesight, bad backs, ergonomic problems, muscle strain with hands, and of course, all the mental health stuff that is talked about a lot in the media, but it's very real and serious risk for people, particularly if they're isolated on their own or going through very difficult personal circumstances. And there is, of course, a balance for employers as to how intrusive they should be in relation to employees' personal circumstances. But sticking with the legal position, the health and safety legislation requires risk assessments to be undertaken. That applies as much at home as in the office. The health and safety executive, as always, are very helpful. They've provided a guide on self-assessments for employees to undertake at home using electronic questionnaires, and a sort of methodology for identifying workplace risks and implementing controlling measures. As I've just mentioned, the risks are not just physical. It's increasingly recognized that this way of working poses serious risks of psychiatric injury resulting from stress, isolation, or exhaustion. And where there are these serious risks, these are reasons why people can go to work and work with colleagues in the office if it helps to alleviate these problems. Next slide. Also, the health and safety regulations require consultation with employees. And this is an opportunity for the HR and facilities teams to be reaching out to everyone, to help them with risk assessments, to chat about how things are going at home. You could maybe focus on the desk and the general setup, but it's also an opportunity for people in a fairly low-key way to check in with everyone and see how they are more generally. to have a one-on-one chat with how people are doing and to allow people to raise any issues of concern about their way of working. And I think it's a very good idea for HR, line managers, colleagues to be keeping up in contact and engagement with employees on a one-on-one basis. And I know that's time consuming, but I think these circumstances are so extraordinary that it would be a very helpful thing for people to be keeping in touch, and in particular looking out for any serious health issues that are developing in the workforce and whether the employer can do anything about helping the employee in that situation. One of the areas to think about, obviously, with an employee who may now be completely exhausted, possibly stressed, possibly, and in a serious way, suffering from some form of mental illness. These illnesses can be extremely serious. The employer can be talking about working hours, holidays, and what the employer can do to help. Maybe putting in place buddy and mentoring systems, video calls. And of course, there are the remote social events, but they don't obviously enable an employer to reach out to an individual personally in quite the way that I've been advocating. Next one. There's a big debate on about whether employers should provide equipment. Our view is you don't have to provide an entire new home office setup, but you do have to provide supplementary equipment to enable the employee's existing home setup to be supplemented by equipment needed to work remotely, such as screens, computers, mouse, etc., etc. And we think the employer should pay for that, but the equipment provided remains the property of the employer. The employee may argue that they're incurring increased costs of heating, Wi-Fi, etc. We think the employer isn't liable to pay for that, but they can choose to do so. An employee saying that, well, I'm incurring more heating costs may well be saving a lot of money on the commute, so it cuts both ways. And it's not the employer's fault that everyone has been asked to stay at home by the government. But the employer can choose to contribute to the increased cost at home. And there is a tax-free allowance of £300 a year, which helps everybody out. Next slide.
Yeah.
Oh dear. Right, thank you, Joe. As you can see, I'm not in charge of the slides.
Sorry, have I gone into the wrong one?
Joe's job. So, working from home abroad, one of the slightly amusing features of the whole situation has been people not being quite sure where everyone is, and some employers have sort of had a bit of difficulty tracking down their employees because, of course, not surprisingly, some people, particularly those with families abroad who come from overseas, have scooted off to somewhere a little bit warmer to work, since it doesn't seem to matter very much exactly where you are. Well, it doesn't matter very much if you've got a good Wi-Fi and it's all working in a practical way, but it does matter from an employment law and a tax law viewpoint. And if somebody has actually disappeared to work in the south of France, there are lots and lots of legal and tax issues to think about. Now, there's a bit of a checklist on the screen. There's a point about the employment contract and are you allowing a variation of the place of work? Obviously, most employers are going to want to take up the position this is a temporary variation to the contract necessitated by the pandemic. You do need to take up the position, I think, that your consent is required. And most employers are putting in place a policy on working overseas fairly rapidly to make the point, well, we do have some say in this. And this is a contractual issue. And if we're allowing it on the terms of a policy and it's temporary. This is not a permanent state of affairs, unless, of course, the employer chooses to agree that. So the next issue, of course, is tax and social security, because employees may become subject to tax and social security wherever they've landed up, and the employer might have to comply with local PAYE rules to deduct and account for tax. Employees who've gone to employee-friendly jurisdictions may be acquiring very good employment rights if you choose to make them redundant, and that could complicate the process and make it more expensive. And there may be some technical requirements to notify the government of the place where the employee is working that they're actually there and working for you. Next slide. Data protection and security, cybersecurity issues rear their head. Can the employees comply with the data protection laws where they are? And can personal data and confidential information be protected overseas? and there's a need for a data privacy risk assessment potentially. And of course, the UK's imminent departure from the EU without a trade deal complicates things as well. But I'm not even going to think about that one just yet, because I suspect we will have a trade deal. So let's not panic just yet. Another potential issue is insurance. Will business liability insurance cover an employee overseas? And there are, of course, the health and safety obligations I've just been talking about, not just the UK ones, but whatever applies where the employee is. And just the final sort of list of problems on the whole checklist is the possibility that if you've got a clump of employees, say in Paris, that you've set up a permanent establishment over there, and that might have consequences for the employer. So one way or another, this is something to pay attention to, and obviously you'll need specific advice on the specific circumstances. Once you've got to the moment where the employee is returning home, either because they've decided to or you've asked them to, then obviously on return back, they have to comply with any quarantine rules, which generally means they do, because most places require quarantine, and it's an offence for both the employer and the employee to ignore that. Next one. Holiday. Our articles on holiday entitlement have been super popular on Lexology and generally, which shows that this is a really big issue. Furloughed employees accrue holiday and are entitled to furlough pay whilst on holiday. You can top it up though. Employers can require employees to take holiday. You have to give notice under the working time regulations, and the notice required is twice the amount of days that the employer wants the employee to take. Now, I think that's a bit aggressive in the current times, because the general rule is I think you want to be nice to everybody, but it does exist. And I think there is a line between requiring people to take holiday and consulting people about whether they've taken enough and isn't it time for them to take a break. And for those who just simply haven't been able to take their holiday due to reasons relating to the coronavirus pandemic, then it is a good idea to, sorry, I've just lost a screen. Right, back on. It is a good idea. Sorry, I'm going to start again, because the rule is that if it's not been reasonably practicable for a worker to take some or all of their leave to which they're entitled as a result of the effects of the coronavirus, they can carry it forward under an amendment to the working time regulations. But not being able to travel or not wanting to take a holiday during lockdown will not constitute an exception. So I think that's a fairly clear line there. And finally, I'm going to finish with a little bit of good news because I've been looking at the position for travel, starting with domestic travel and then on to international travel, where things look as if they might be about to improve. In relation to domestic travel within the United Kingdom, in all three tiers, if travel is going to be necessary for work, then it will be permitted, including travel between different tiers. Travel in tier 3 is going to be the most restricted, but even in tier 3, it's possible to travel on business and for work. You have to reduce the number of journeys, be sensible about that, but it is possible to travel within tier 3 or to move from tiers 1 and 2 to tier 3. And overnight stays are permitted in tier 3 where necessary for work. And accommodation providers in tier 3 are allowed to be open for people staying away for work. The government, as with all things and all aspects of our life, have issued some guidance on safer travel. And so employers should be making sure that their employees follow the guidance, which includes face masks on public transport, staggered travel, avoiding busy times, all of which means that people can come and go at more flexible times in order to comply with the safer travel guidance. And that should be encouraged by employees. And finally, international travel, which is where there is some more light at the end of the tunnel. International travel is permitted for work. One point to bear in mind is that we're so focused on our own rules and regulations that you have to think about what the rules are at the other end. So if the employee is going to another jurisdiction, that jurisdiction may require testing before departure or on arrival. And it is necessary for the employee to comply with the local laws and for you to look into that before they set off. On return, we're back to quarantine, and the current situation is the passenger has to complete the passenger locator form and self-isolate for 14 days if required, if you're not in one of the safe corridors. There are, however, some specific exemptions for specialist workers who don't have to quarantine, such as people working in power plants, essential infrastructure, some medical emergency stuff, and so on and so forth. But if you're not in one of those exemptions, then it's 14 days quarantine at the moment, and employers should not encourage or require an employee to attend the office. Otherwise, there could be a fine of up to £10,000, just one of the many ways in which we could all be fined at the moment. But light at the end of the tunnel, I've read somewhere in the Telegraph probably, which is usually fairly reliable in terms of knowing what's going on in government, that a government announcement is expected soon, reducing quarantine from 14 days to 5 days, provided the passenger tests on the 5th day. And it could begin in December. It seems as if private companies will be assisting the airlines and the airports with testing. And if that is all true, and if it all happens, then it means that the opportunity to go away on holiday beckons, along with making it easier for employers to bring people into the UK, perhaps from America. There's been a lot of talk about opening up the New York-London corridor and from other key business destinations. So I'd like to end on a positive note. It's been a pleasure talking to you.